Hey everyone, just before the show starts with Chris, I just wanted to say a small note on what the show is about. It's the Untrodden podcast, the idea being that I really want to go to simultaneously kind of ground that we take for granted in discussions and also to more obscure subjects. And I really want to combine both in a podcast format to really get on academics or just personalities online, whatever it is, to argue with and see, what are the fundamentals of what they think and place them in a broader ideological discussion so we can really reorient ourselves in the modern world. That's what I'm hoping to do here. And hopefully you can see echoes of that in the rest of this episode and enjoy. Thank you for watching. Okay, so hi everyone. So I'm here with Chris Cutrone. We're going to be. This is the first episode of a new podcast that I'm doing, which absolutely no listener knows anything about, obviously by the nature of that. So this is the Untrodden podcast, where I'm really just going to be inviting different people on who I really want to discuss and sort of push a bit more and try to get to some new ground that they haven't spoken, at least publicly or on YouTube or in that sort of format. So my first guest here, the first person I want to talk to is Chris Cutrone, and he is the last Marxist. He has a very unique presence on the left, good and bad, very controversial. And I think that is why he's important to talk to because I think he's holding on to a tradition, an intellectual tradition that is you could call it old school Marxism. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but it's
Hmm.
important to deal with that and engage with that. I myself, for anyone listening, I am a liberal. That's how I'm going to be approaching these conversations. I very much want to uphold the liberal tradition and the establishment, I guess you could say. But I like to think that I'm aware of many of the problems with that, and I'm very critical of it. So I'd like to talk to all sorts of different people. So that's where I'm coming from here. The first thing I wanted to talk to you about, I don't know if it was the first question I gave you, but the first thing I wanted to start with actually is Lenin. Um,
Yeah.
so I've been reading a lot of your essays on Lenin and also listening to you talk about Lenin. And I guess for me, the way I understand how you understand Lenin is that he's very much kind of a he kind of the way that people respond to him, I think, is like really crucial for understanding like how Marxist they are, how they, what kind of Marxist they are is very much defined by how they engage with Lenin. And I think for
Hmm.
you point out how some people say Lenin is authoritarian because of the way his regime went or some of his
Hmm.
later works, and then others will say Lenin's an anarchist and he was criticized for being more of an anarchist, right? And so you're really trying to say all of that is kind of distracting from the fact that Lenin is really important to understand and how he was engaging with the tradition and he was living in his moment. And we really have to learn from the way that Lenin dealt with those problems. And we really have to learn from him because he was really accurately looking around at the world around him and the situation. And if you don't at least understand why he did the things he did or how he was looking at things, then you're kind of like behind him. You're not really caught up to where you need to be as a Marxist, I
Right.
guess.
Right.
So yeah, what do you think about that? Would you agree with that? Would you agree with that characterization or?
Yeah, that's my basic approach. Definitely. I see Lenin as an important historical figure, a kind of central historical figure in a couple of different respects. So one as like, 20th century revolutionary, and the other as a figure in Marxism. And so he's the dividing figure in Marxism between like pro-Lenin, anti-Lenin, or Leninist, anti-Leninist. And then it gets even more complicated after that because there are different varieties of Leninist Marxism as well. So yes, but I do think that he's a tabooed figure and a dogmatized figure. And he's a loaded figure. He might be, in terms of the political world, the most controversial figure of all time,
Yeah,
perhaps.
maybe.
Right? There would be religious figures that might be more controversial, but in the political realm, he might be the one. And so he kind of haunts the landscape. I think that even like I always like to, you know, in terms of mainstream politics, cite how these things come up. Steve Bannon, who I don't think is really the Trump's brain or something, But he said, Marx is right, capitalism commodifies and dehumanizes everything, and Lenin is right, power is in the streets, right? And which is, obviously that's just a caricature of Lenin. Nonetheless, he's kind of inescapable figure, especially on the left. I feel like on the left, Lenin is an inescapable figure.
Yeah. So what I really want to approach this from a couple different angles. So the first one is kind of the way that other Marxists or leftists, I mean, they might not be Marxists, but the way that other
Mm-hmm.
figures approach Lenin and how do you respond to that. And then maybe at the end, I'll give like more of how I respond to that and how I see that, and you
Mm-hmm.
can tell me what you think about that. So the
Mm-hmm.
first thing is I was listening to there's this very it's famous on like YouTube on the internet at least. There's this famous clip of Chomsky responding to a student question or some question about Lenin, and he goes through his critique, which I think is pretty. I think it's a good clip because it really shows different. I would say like three main strains of what he thinks about Lenin, and maybe the
Mm-hmm.
Bolsheviks altogether.
Mm-hmm.
And so those three things, I want to go through them like one by one with you to hear what you think about them because I think
Okay.
yeah, they're they're interesting. I guess I would say. So the
Mm-hmm.
first one the most that I found kind of strange, but I know that there's some basis for saying this, but it does seem the most out there. But I do want to hear what you think. He says basically that that Marx wrote a lot about Russia in his later years, and he especially was interested in like the peasant movements and like the peasant communes and like unique peasant culture in Russia and how that would lead to some sort of socialist event. And he basically says that the Bolsheviks and Lenin just like censored all of that. They just like pushed that aside. They didn't want anything to do with that. And so I'm just
Mm.
curious, like, have you heard this claim before, or what do you think about that specific claim right there?
Right. So I think that someone like Noam Chomsky in particular, so he's an anarchist, self-avowed, and he really likes Peter Kropotkin. And so because of that, he has a great deal of knowledge about and sympathy for pre-1917, pre-Russian Revolution, revolutionary traditions, revolutionary movements. And so all that he's saying is that the Bolsheviks, in seizing power in the Russian Revolution of 1917, basically eclipsed and then, surely actively suppressed this other alternative revolutionary tradition that Marx himself had been sympathetic to.
Yeah,
And there's a term for this that is a little bit ungenerous with regard to Chomsky, which is the Narodniks and Narodnism, which is actually something else. It's something different from Kropotkin. The other thing that I'll say about Kropotkin is that even though Lenin, fiercely disagreed with Kropotkin, he still had a lot of respect for him. And I think they gave him some grand state funeral
yeah,
after the revolution. And so, but that's really what it comes down to. It comes down to look, there are these other revolutionary traditions, and Marxism, and in particular Leninism, is responsible for suppressing these other revolutionary traditions that Chomsky wants to uphold as a real alternative, as a much better alternative.
yeah. Well, on that, I think the other 2 points that I think he makes, one of them is about like parliamentary socialism or like social democracy, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that according to Marx, so he wants to uphold Marx. It seems like
Right,
he doesn't want to just discard Marx. And he
right,
says that according to Marx, that in Britain, that it would be possible for the parliament to, through a parliamentary solution, you could have socialism.
right.
And I mean, in my reading of Marx, in reading the English journalism, it's very clear that he's very skeptical and cynical towards Parliament. I don't know that that necessarily means that you couldn't have socialism in Parliament. It just means that the current parliamentary system is a mess. But it does
Right.
seem harder to justify that you could get to socialism through there. So, what do you think about? Is there a
Well,
parliamentary socialism or?
yes. So I will just say that Lenin himself said to other people in the Communist International that was just founded in the wake of the Russian Revolution, he said, well, the path that they took in Russia, that the Bolsheviks took, really only got them so far, and perhaps is not the path that other countries or other revolutionaries should follow. Right. So he's got a famous image, which is climbing up a mountain, and you're climbing up the mountain, and you get to a point where you realize you can't reach the top this way, so you have to trace your steps back down the mountain and find a different way up. And he says that that's as much a part of the Russian revolutionary experience as is their success. So he's attacking other, wannabe Bolshevik emulators, and saying, look, you really are misunderstanding the history here. So he says, perhaps it will be through parliament. Perhaps it will be through a kind of syndicalistic labor union movement rather than workers' councils, right? Because that's the thing. It was like arguing against people who later became the council communists.
Yeah.
And he's saying, like, we took the workers' councils as far as they could go, and that's also true of like Germany, the German Revolution, and that, it was important, but it shouldn't be kind of hypostasized or fetishized. Um, and that, in fact, because history doesn't really repeat itself, maybe precisely for that reason, it won't be this way. Now, but what he meant was a parliamentary road to revolution, meaning not a parliamentary road to socialism in the sense of social democratic reforms, but rather a revolutionary situation brought about by a socialist majority in parliament,
Right. Yeah.
right? That it might provoke, a civil war or a coup d'état or something, right? That in the defense of capitalism, what happened in Chile with Salvador Allende and Pinochet having a coup against a socialist elected leader. Um, that you know, so it's a parliamentary road to revolution,
Right.
not just to socialism, because socialism could mean anything,
Sure. Yeah.
especially nowadays. Socialism means all sorts of things. And so, in this respect, that's just, of course, true. But that would mean other conditions, meaning not just through like capitalist parties arguing over this or that tweaking of policy, but it would mean, like they had in Germany, a majority socialist party or the largest single party. Not, I don't think they had an outright majority in the Reichstag, but they had a plurality. They were the largest single party, and in fact, that did produce a political crisis around the time of the German Revolution. And also, you could say maybe leading up to World War One, the Germans hoped that World War One would stop the growth of socialism, and they started thinking about launching a war to stop the socialists after the socialists became the largest party in 1912.
Right.
This is well documented. So that's really the issue. The issue is, um, means and ends. We could say means and ends, meaning there may be many means to the struggle for socialism. There may be many means to the ends of socialism.
Yeah, I think one of the things you talk about a lot is how, revolution isn't just. I think we think of revolution, at least I used to think of revolution as very much like a violent political, like, coup
Right.
event. But what you
Right.
talk about is that, like, the social revolution is also, like, crucially important. And so
Right.
I guess what you're saying is if you had a parliamentary solution and that resulted in a, you know, significant social revolution, I mean, that would be legitimate, perhaps.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but I think one of the third point that I think Chomsky brings up, and this is again relevant here, and I can kind of see what you would answer, but worth bringing up, I guess,
Hmm.
is that he says that Lenin is a right wing deviation, and that the left communists, which of course Lenin called the infantile ones you were referring to there with the childish Bolsheviks, but the
Right.
imitators, but what Chomsky is saying, and he says that the mainstream Marxist, again, because he wants to hold on to the Marxist tradition in some sense, he says the mainstream Marxist, naming a few like Rosa Luxemburg. He doesn't name others.
Right.
I assume that like Kautsky and Bernstein would be involved in that.
He might mean Kautsky, probably not Bernstein, but maybe
Oh,
Kautsky.
yeah. So what do you think about like where? Do you think he's right that the mainstream Marxists were more like that, whether you agree with them or not? Do you think he's right that they were different than Lenin, and you just like agree with that, but you disagree with who's correct, or do you think he's completely wrong about what was mainstream?
I mean, this is obviously something that's very controversial, meaning that there are different ways of analyzing this. You could say that Lenin is a leftist and Kautsky is a centrist, and Bernstein was like a rightist
Yeah.
within the Marxist movement. You
Yeah.
could say that. But then that does raise the issue of Luxembourg. And yes, Chomsky definitely wants to uphold Luxembourg, but if you push him on it, see, he's defending Marxism in a particular way. It's an anarchist kind of thought figure that goes all the way back to Bakunin, but really became prominent, I think, after the 60s, which is Marxism in theory, but anarchism in practice. And in some ways, you could trace that very idea back to Marx himself, meaning, and Lenin said this also in The State and Revolution, which Chomsky thinks Lenin had to write in order to fool people,
Yeah.
that the anarchists are right about the goal, but they're wrong about the means for achieving it. And they're also wrong about the lack of a transitional state. So you could say the goal is anarchy, the goal is anarchism, the goal is abolition of the state, because that's what that means. It doesn't mean social chaos or something. Um, Abolition of the state is the goal, but how are we going to get there? And can it only wither away and not just be abolished in one stroke? And the reason that Marxists say that it can't be abolished in one stroke is that the Marxists don't think capitalism can be abolished in one stroke.
Yeah.
Whereas the anarchists kind of do, or they think you get rid of the state and that takes care of it. And, this is why Marxists would say that anarchists lack a theory. They lack a theory of the state, they lack a theory of capitalism, really. But they lack a theory of the capitalist state specifically. They lack a theory of why the state is doing what it's doing by necessity in capitalism, which they're much more romantic, the anarchists. They just think the state is a creature, an instrument of the ruling class. But again, Marxists don't even think the ruling class is the cause of the problem of capitalism, let alone of the state.
Right.
Right. So that's the difficulty is that, you know, I think that yeah, generally speaking, what people's apprehension of these things are that there are some people who are more authoritarian statist in disposition, and there are others who are more liberal or anarchist in disposition.
Yeah.
There are people who like order, there are people who like freedom. And the Marxist view is that this is much more of a structural problem with society and capitalism, we
Yeah.
could say. And although that term can be abused too, because it's not like some kind of structuralism or some kind of structural determinism, and people now talk about structural racism and structural this, structural that,
Yeah.
which tends to mystify things. But you could say that there's something more objectively problematic about capitalism
Yeah.
that doesn't allow us to simply deal with it dispositionally or psychologically, authoritarian versus libertarian.
Yeah. That's very much the feeling I have when I read like Foucault. He's kind of annoying to me. Like as a liberal, it's like it's annoying to me because it very much feels like he's just mad at the vibe of power, like the ruling class. It all feels very vibes based, I guess you could say, and it feels
Uh-huh.
it feels like it really does feel like a degradation or like a step behind where Marx is at. Like it feels like Marx is
Mm-hmm.
at least dealing with the issue. Like I could argue with him about the issue, whereas Foucault just
Mm-hmm.
wants to say, man, aren't the people in power like they're kind of bad? They do shady things, and it's like okay, but yeah, I don't know. I find that kind of frustrating. But
Mm-hmm.
um, so you think so like directly like do you think Chomsky is just wrong then about what the mainstream Marxists thought? Do you think he's just like using their legacy or
I think he's tendentious and wrong in that respect, meaning he's trying to appropriate the history of Marxism for his purposes. What he's saying is that within Marxism, there was dissent against this Leninist line. And of course, he would want the left wing dissent rather than the conservative dissent. He would want the Luxembourg dissent, not the Kautsky dissent.
Right.
So the people who either rejected or criticized what the Bolsheviks did in the Russian Revolution. So Kautsky rejected it, Luxemburg criticized it. So he doesn't want to be seen as too conservative, too social democratic, too upholding of, bourgeois electoral politics because, he's an anarchist. So he goes looking for a sympathetic figure in Marxism, and it's Luxemburg.
Right.
And of course, the left communists, the council communists, also claimed Luxemburg against Lenin as well. And I just think this is it's a gross misrepresentation not only of Lenin but of Luxemburg, and
Right.
that from our perspective, especially, but also for a long time now, like the time of the council communists back in the 20s, all the way up to Chomsky, from the 60s onward, Luxemburg and Lenin agreed far more with each other than either of them agree with anybody else today.
Right.
So that's the thing. That's the challenge is that whatever differences and criticisms they had of each other, they still agree at a much more fundamental level than we tend to attend to. We don't pay attention to what they agreed on. We kind of gloss over the most fundamental assumptions of Marxism and deal with things much more superficially.
Yeah. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about for Lenin specifically is sort of like the liberal view of Lenin, which is a whole different thing,
Hmm.
right? Because
Hmm.
people liberals like myself, we tend to view Lenin as kind of a fanatic who kind of went a bit too far. We don't like people who go a little bit too far, too dictatorial, um, whatever it
An
is.
extremist.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, I fully understand the difference between someone like Lenin and Stalin. Like they seem like completely different figures to me. So we don't have to get into that right
Mm.
now. But what I'm
Hmm.
curious about is someone like Gabriel Rockhill, who I know you have a lot of disagreements with, which is the point.
Right.
He sort of says that obviously he's way more sympathetic to Stalin, and so he says that
Right.
that the CIA just lied about Stalin, and that like the French theorists and the Frankfurt School they fell for the lie, because he says like there's internal documents in the CIA where they admit that Stalin wasn't a dictator, which I think what he cites for that is like some line where the CIA says that they have like multiple people who help him make decisions, and that means he's not a dictator, which I think is a
Oh wow.
stretch. I
Yeah,
think
I
that's a
know.
stretch for
Uh-huh.
that citation. But ignoring that, why do you? My
Right.
question really is, where do you think that reputation for Lenin comes from people like myself? So not for Marxists, but for liberals. Why do you think there is that interpretation of Lenin? Do you think it's CIA misinformation, like like Rockhill would say, or do you think there's something of substance there? Like, why do you think we liberals have that perception of Lenin specifically?
I mean, look, the Russian Revolution, there were things that Lenin did that have to be seen as problematic in some way. Um, so again, I think Rosa Luxemburg said, of course, we sympathize with Lenin and Trotsky. They're good comrades because it was seen that they were the leaders, the two of them.
Right.
Um, but they're going to be forced by circumstance to do things in Russia that we can't sign on for. And, we're Marxists, we remain critical. What else can anyone expect from us? And okay, so then what did she have in mind? Well, they had to take repressive measures, gambling on that it would lead to a socialist revolution in Europe, that it would be worth it in some way, to not allow the revolution to fall in Russia, that the price would not be too high and
Yeah.
the benefit would be worth it. I think that, I mean, it's a complicated story. It's a very complicated story because there are two waves. There's the initial wave, there's the Russian Civil War, which is incredibly brutal, really terrible. Then there's a period of peace, in the 20s. There's the new economic policy era. But then there's the 5-year plan and forced collectivization of agriculture. There's the stuff that comes after the Great Depression sets in. And, there are the purge trials, there's the gulag, there's just so much. And can you see that later stuff as already happening? in Lenin's own lifetime. In certain respects, sure, you know. So, towards the end of the Civil War, or some people argue it was after the Civil War was over, the Kronstadt Mutiny,
Oh yeah.
was put down in a very bloody way, and Trotsky even said that they should drop poison gas on them from airplanes. Just wipe them out. As it turned out, they didn't do that. Actually, more people on the pro-Bolshevik side died putting down the Kronstadt mutiny than the Kronstadters died in that conflict. So, and they didn't celebrate it. Lenin and Trotsky didn't celebrate it as a glorious victory. They thought it was a regrettable necessity, putting down the Kronstadt mutiny. So, there's just a lot to this. And then you get into how it became a one-party dictatorship and how factions within the Bolshevik Party were banned in 1920. You get to basically illiberal measures,
Right.
the curtailment of freedom, very explicitly, um, you know, and acknowledged as such and justified.
Yeah.
Justified exigently, in some ways justified on principle. So there's a lot to take issue with. There is. Um, Now, again, the question is, I think that the analog is not Stalin because there is something else going on later. The analog is like the Jacobins in the French
Oh yeah.
Revolution. The Committee for Public Safety and the terror and the guillotining of people. You Although even that is much less than what the Bolsheviks did. So, the question is, what were they trying to do? How did they understand what they were trying to do? Because the measures that they took, the specific measures that they took, may or may not have been justifiable. But there is the question of what were they trying to do? And is it a matter of, oh, they were utopians who tried to impose their will on society, tried to force socialism, and therefore necessarily had to repeat the Robespierre, mistake of a republic of virtue being imposed on people,
Yeah.
except on a much, wider and more brutal scale with the Bolsheviks. Is that what they were trying to do? And of course, as Marxists, they were not trying to do that. That's not how they understood it. But I think that it's easily mistaken for that. That here you have, intransigent socialists, communists trying to impose their will on society, and it will always take this form if, if you try to do that.
Right.
I would say that that's the liberal view.
Yeah. I mean, I try to take people more like on their own terms and believe them. So I don't tend to just be like communism is evil and it's like a specter that holds people and grasps them and then they do horrible things. I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, but I do think I am still wary of it for those reasons. So,
Mm-hmm.
regardless, I want to move into a completely different, well, fairly different subject, which is Donald Trump and Bonapartism.
Right. All right.
And the reason I
Speaking of
want to,
which,
yeah, the reason I
right.
want to do that is actually reading the 18th Brumaire and listening to you mention the 18th Brumaire actually, and then
Yep.
deciding to read it was one of the most like compelling experiences for me. So if anything was like the most compelling argument for me for Marxism, it was reading that, and it still
Ah.
remains to be the case.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the biggest issues I take with you, I guess, that I want to challenge you a little bit, is how you respond to Trump. To some degree, I can understand it. So I'm not here to give you like you should support Kamala, and Trump is really bad because the right wing is bad. I'm not here to give you like a really childish, you know. I hope not to do that. But I'm
Uh-huh.
actually curious because for me, Donald Trump really fits within the phenomenon of Bonapartism. Like if there
Mm-hmm.
is like a really good argument against liberalism, to me, it's very much that Marx may have been onto something about the state of like parliamentary politics in France, and that he identified that you know that Louis Bonaparte was very much the symptom, not the cause.
Mhm.
And that was his
Mhm.
criticism of liberals, is that they called him like the cause. He just came out of nowhere, and he said no, he's a symptom of a deeper problem. And so I find that to be like the most compelling argument against liberalism that I have to take up. I think, and I think Trump is an example of that to me. Trump is not a one-to-one figure, but I think Trump is very much a symptom of a failing system. That's how
Mhm.
I would see him. Whereas
Mhm.
sometimes when I listen to you, it feels like more um, you're more just interested by Trump. Like, oh, he's fighting against the Bonapartist state of the Democrats and the federal system. And so I understand how that is Bonapartist, according to Marxists. I don't take issue with that. Like, I don't take issue with that formulation, but I do take issue with the idea that like Trump is against the Bonapartist state, whereas I would say he's a different form of like that Bonapartist crisis, if that makes
Right.
sense. He's part
Of
of it.
course.
So,
Absolutely. Of
yeah,
course. Yeah, no, I think that no, I would agree with that. Meaning that um I mean, probably the most controversial thing that I've been arguing for a number of years, and really before Trump already, is centering uh, Marx's theory of Bonapartism as a characterization of the capitalist state per se, and in a way that he generalized it in his own time. So it wasn't just about exigent circumstances of Louis Bonaparte
right.
and 1848 revolution and Second Republic France, but he saw analogs elsewhere like Bismarck in Germany, but also what he called parliamentary Bonapartism in the UK.
Yeah, like Palmerston. Yeah,
And Palmerston, Gladstone, Disraeli,
yeah,
like the liberals, not just Tories, right?
yeah.
Um, and also the centrality, my friend and colleague Spencer Leonard has published two books of Marx's writings. In a sense, identity of Bonapartism and imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
So the imperial state, the imperialist state, um, the imperial presidency in the United States, like how that differs from what came before. And so I've broadened the category in a way that other Marxists and other readers of Marx object to. And that also means using the term differently than liberals do, because liberals tend to treat it as more like state of emergency exigent rather than a kind of condition of the
Right,
state under capitalism, that the capitalist state per se is Bonapartist because it has to manage contradiction and crisis in capitalism, that increasingly becomes its role, and that therefore you can't turn back the clock on it, and also that dialectically Bonapartism is the doppelganger or shadow of the dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning the dictatorship of the proletariat, the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat for Marx is that historical necessity is demonstrated by Bonapartism, meaning this necessity will be met and it only matters how it's met politically.
right,
So, and so in that respect, like a kind of critical Bonapartism, we could call it, um, is Marx's perspective that he doesn't just have a condemnation of Bonapartism or the Bonapartism of the capitalist state, but sees its historical necessity and then looks to see how it points beyond itself. Meaning, this kind of role of the state could either point to the perpetuation of capitalism, or the same thing could point to the potential transcendence of capitalism. And this would be a difference with like Chomsky and anarchism,
yeah,
right? Because this is really what they dispute with Marx is the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is an enigmatic kind of concept because it's kind of like, well, if it's the majority, then how is it a dictatorship? And
right,
but it really dictatorship in the sense of an illiberal state, right? So that whole question of, what kind of rule the working class will need to exercise in order to abolish capitalism, it will mean abrogating the rights of people, not just the capitalists, but also the workers. It will involve a curtailment of like the labor market and things like that, you know. But again, this is super obscure because we only know this negatively. We don't really know it positively. And then the Russian Revolution is this really crazy example that I think is highly misleading.
right.
So I think that that's really the trick. So what I've done is I've tried to take the opportunity of Trump, the the teaching opportunity
Hmm.
of Trump to say, okay, Trump demonstrates something. Especially because Trump arrives at this moment of the millennial left, coming out of the Great Recession, coming out of the forever wars, the war on terror, came out of the discontents that gave us, a new left movement in the 21st century. That Trump is responding to the same crisis that they were responding to. And I think that, Bernie Sanders also, but I think that we have to sort of confront this problem of politics and the state. We can't just sort of make a compromise and then naturalize that in some way. Say, oh, okay, we want the state to do these things, but not those things. You know, now Trump is a Republican president, he's a conservative, although he's objected to being characterized as a conservative. And he said that the Republican Party shouldn't be conservative, shouldn't be a conservative party. But he is a conservative, and he was elected by a conservative electorate. And therefore, he promised certain things that he's fulfilling that are manifestly conservative, like law and order, you know? And part of the problem is that Trump proudly announces what other administrations would have just done quietly: violate people's rights, deport people, so he's like proud of it and will trumpet it and, be seen to be doing it as opposed to denying it, which is what Obama and Biden did and what Harris surely would have done, which is do the same thing but deny that they're doing it. So, with Trump, we have a level of transparency that I think we have to try to learn from and not just bemoan and condemn. Right. So I think that the way I've written this is I don't defend Trump. I defend reality against the misrepresentations of Trump. He's a fascist, he's whatever. Like, don't normalize Trump. So Trump is extraordinary in the sense that we're living through an extraordinary crisis in the political sphere, but he's probably the most moderate conservative possible expression of that crisis. So either the crisis could be denied and sort of kick the can down the road, or you could do things dishonestly, or it could be done openly and, acknowledged. And then if that's the case, then he is probably the most moderate conservative version of that we could possibly have, given the options.
Sure.
So that's where I see, Trump as a phenomenon of demonstrating. Now, again, Bonapartism, I think Marx was very good on Bonapartism. The Bonapartism is opaque, meaning that Trump fighting against the deep state, but trying to turn the deep state into his instrument, renders it opaque, renders the deep state opaque, very opaque. Like, what is going on? Who's trying to get rid of Pete Hegseth? Is he being targeted by people in the Pentagon who object to Trump's policies? Is he, you know, are the Trumpists trying to undermine Pete Hegseth because he's not down with the program enough? Right? It's very opaque. And I think that that's another aspect of things that Marx called attention to that we should also not forget, which is the opacity of this kind of bureaucratic administrative state. It's all sorts of unprincipled interpersonal conflicts among bureaucrats that then filters up into the political sphere, and the motivations are very unclear. And so we get conspiracy theories, and it might just be in the nature of things, meaning it may not be, you know, a question of, okay, there's a clear explanation versus a conspiracy theory paranoid fantasy, right? Like it may not be the paranoid fantasy of the conspiracy theorist, but there also may not be a clear explanation in terms of like principles
Right.
in conflict.
Yeah. I mean, I have a few problems with that. Like the difficulty here is like obviously we have principal disagreements. Like I can never I can't just wholeheartedly accept the Bonapartist like scheme, but I do think it's like interesting, and so I don't want to. I want to
Mm-hmm.
fight you on your terms. I don't want to like just say you're wrong about that because that's not very interesting. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess the few things you're doing there, the things I want to pick out specifically is you're essentially saying that the Bonapartist state that exists it violates rights anyway. And so Marx points this out when he looks at like the French Constitution and he says this is all violated numerous times. It basically means nothing. And so he really shows, you know, the hypocrisy of the liberals and how this is built into. But what I object to, I guess, and maybe I'm just naive, but I haven't been convinced otherwise practically, what I object to is I think the current state of affairs is substantively different. I think the regime and the rights that are given to us are they're held and they have meaning, and I think Donald Trump is like clearly abridging those things, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
understand why you wouldn't uphold that regime because of obvious reasons. But what I don't
Right.
understand is how you think that there isn't a substantive difference between those things. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, presidents in the past deported people, of course,
Mm-hmm.
but the way that Trump is doing it is a abridgment of like due process and fundamental things, which I won't disagree that they weren't always held up, but there was an actual standard there. There was a principle. There was a rule
Uh-huh.
of law. And it
Uh-huh.
seems objectively obvious to me that Trump is violating the rule of law and that he's breaking norms which were actually beneficial for people, right? And so,
Mm-hmm.
you know, again, I'm not objecting to your
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
rejecting those things, but I think there's a substantive difference, and so I'm confused on why you don't acknowledge that, even if you don't think it's crucial.
I think that I could acknowledge that, meaning I could say that Trump's pushing the envelope and that he is definitely like intentionally testing things, pushing the boundaries in a way that might have happened in a more arbitrary happenstance way previously. Meaning, surely people have been unjustly deported in the past without adequate due process. Definitely. Like, there are
Sure.
thousands of cases, I'm sure. So, there are two things to keep in mind. One is that, of course, the opposition to Trump, from the Democrats as well as from within the Republican Party, they are going to seize on certain things, especially if they think they can provoke a constitutional crisis or have grounds for impeachment or whatever, right? So they're going to do that. It's in the nature of political competition. Um, and especially around someone like Trump. So they're going to do that in a way that they might not have done, the Republicans might not have done with Obama, or the Democrats might not have done with George W. Bush. They're going to do that with Trump to a greater degree. But also, Trump's going to welcome it, meaning he's going to welcome the opportunity to test the constitutional limits, especially of the presidency. Um, so, I don't think that any of these things are good, these developments, these phenomena are good. However, it is happening. And I would say that the lawfare against Trump that was conducted, trying to prosecute him on untested legal theories and unprecedented applications of the law, even changing the law. They changed the law in New York State so that E. Jean Carroll could sue him for sexual assault. They got rid of the statute of limitations just so that that could happen. And only briefly. In other words, they lifted the statute of limitations for a year just to give that window so that that lawsuit could be mounted against Trump. So I think that the other argument that I've made that is perhaps most controversial, which is different from the Bonapartist argument, in fact, which is that a strong executive is actually necessary precisely for liberal reasons. Meaning you want civilian authority over the bureaucratic state, you want presidential authority over law enforcement at the federal level, and you also want executive action versus judicial and legislative action. the unitary executive theory, right? Um, I do think that probably the post-Nixon reforms have bureaucratized things, meaning have given the bureaucratic state more power than it should have, not only over the president, but also over Congress, and also as a way of like avoiding the judiciary. So the Supreme Court got rid of the Chevron deference.
Right.
They basically said, okay, actually, we're going to put it back in the courts, right? We're going to take away this delegation to the bureaucratic administrators, but I'll bring it back to the courts, like bring it back to Congress and to the courts. So I think that there's a lot going on that has to do with a broader crisis, and I think within that crisis, Trump is and his administration are pushing the envelope in certain ways that I think are natural according to the Constitution, as well as political in the sense of, specific conflicts that Trump has had and does have with respect to his policies and what he's trying to do. Now, like I said, I don't think these are welcome developments because, sets a bad precedent in many respects. But all sorts of things are coming up for question and are going to be adjudicated. They're going to be adjudicated through elections. They're going to be adjudicated through the courts. They're going to be adjudicated through policy, these sort of executive order type things. I think that, um, Obama and Biden also said that they were going to do things that may or may not be constitutional and then just see how it plays out in the courts.
Right.
So I think that that's where I see Trump as definitely pushing the envelope, but not qualitatively different. Not qualitatively different. I mean, there are some things that, again, pushing the envelope, it's a judgment call. Is it quantity or quality? Meaning getting El Salvador to take deportees who won't be accepted by their home countries. This is, way beyond black sites in Guantanamo Bay,
Right.
And so none of these things are good, but I think that understanding the actual motivation for them, and the kind of crisis that we're in that's creating this opportunity and circumstance for this to happen. Clearly there are these Republicans around Trump who have wanted to do these things for a long time. And, you know, and there is continuity from Reagan to George W. Bush to Trump.
Yeah.
In terms of pushing back against the Nixon era reforms. So I just think that the Nixon era reforms were untenable. And the naturalization, this is stuff in my lifetime. So in my lifetime, it's like Nixon is the worst president ever.
Yeah.
And therefore these reforms were completely justified. And I just feel like I can't assume any of those things. I can't. I can't say Nixon is the worst president ever. I can't say Watergate is like this unbelievable scandal. Like when you look at, what was done by prior presidents and by subsequent presidents, Watergate is kind of nothing. And so I think we can't assume any of this. The sort of progressive narrative, the progressive liberal capitalist political narrative that I was raised on, I don't think we can accept any of that. Not in the sense that we must reject it, but I think that we should at least question it. And that's what these parties are for. They're for questioning each other. In other words, is there a principled objection to the post-Watergate reforms? I think that there is. And I also think that the abuses of the state are abuses of the state. But that why are they doing it? Are they doing it out of mean-spiritedness? Are they doing it out of like authoritarianism, or are they playing a political game? I think that they're playing a political game, especially around these the specific issue of this like one case, the Salvadoran guy, right, who was deported, Kilmar, and I feel like okay, Here's your poster child, and it may or may not be a a grave injustice, either personally in his case or against due process. I think a lot is being revealed. The fact that immigrants don't have rights. They don't
Yeah,
have rights.
yeah,
Or Mahmoud Khalil. Like I'm against them not having these rights. I am against them not having free speech rights or other rights. But they may not have rights, under the present system, in which case we have to change that. We can't just say, oh, Trump,
right. Well, I mean,
right?
I think I agree with you that the Democrats are just using whatever they can use, and sometimes that means it's going to
Right.
be a lie. Sometimes it'll be, but this is where I think you get. This is where I get concerned with the rhetoric you take. Is just
Mm-hmm.
because the Democrats are using it for those shallow reasons. I don't trust the Democrats, the vast majority of them, to have a principled stance on any of these things. And if they do, I don't think it matters. It's yeah, I don't like the
They could be
Democrats.
right anyway.
Yeah,
They could be right
exactly.
anyway.
That's what I want to
Right.
focus on because
But also Trump could be right also.
well, that's true. Yeah, but I think you, like I said, I think you have to take everyone on their terms. And I think when you
Right.
take everyone on their terms, what I think you find is when you say lawfare, right? Like I don't want to argue about the New York case because I don't know enough about it to be honest with you, and I just don't care. I don't think that matters.
Right.
What I really care about when it comes to Trump is that he did a coup attempt, in my opinion, right? And this is something that
Oh, January 6th.
no, not January 6th. No one talks about the coup attempt. The mainstream media does, and this is why I agree with you that the Democrats and the
Uh-huh.
system kind of doesn't care because they don't even talk about this.
What is it?
But the John Eastman memo, the fake elector plot, right? These
Ah,
things.
right. Right,
And
right,
so
right.
for me, like as someone who actually believes in the Constitution and the liberal system, I'm okay with critiquing it, but I think it's a good thing.
Oh yeah.
That's why Trump is substantively different because he actually tried to abridge that the Constitution and the order in order to fraudulently steal the election. Like that just seems like outright fraud. All the other stuff is just like noise compared to that, honestly. And that's why I don't understand why you call the New York case like lawfare. And it's like, okay, but what about the case against him for trying to steal the election? I mean, is that not like, you can call that
Well, that
unprecedented.
was surely lawfare as well. I mean, the thing is, so Eastman. So I'll just tell you that a acquaintance of mine, former member of Platypus, kind of a student of mine, actually did a internship at the Claremont Institute and studied with John Eastman.
Interesting.
These people are not from another planet, right?
No.
Like John Eastman is a conservative liberal. He's not a fascist. He's a conservative liberal. And, he was doing what they do, including the progressive liberals, meaning they look for how they can manipulate the system for their political ends. And so, it's a question of what's the phrase from 1960 from JFK versus Nixon? Stealing it fair and square.
Hmm.
Or the 2000 election, George W. Bush and Al Gore. What the hell was that? Did they steal the election because the Supreme Court stopped the ballot counting? No, that's not. It is a stolen election. It's not a stolen election, right? They stole it fair and square, which means they didn't steal it.
Sure.
And I think that the Trump argument was that the Democrats used the COVID emergency to uh, rig the election by making it much easier for people to vote without having to go to the polling station, and that they loosen the rules on voting to such a degree that they essentially rigged the election. And they rigged it in other ways. They, suppressed the Hunter Biden laptop story. I mean, whatever. They got a whole narrative, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
About
Yeah.
how the Democrats rigged the election. And so, given that fact, that indeed, in Silicon Valley, like mobilized to stop Trump from being reelected in 2020, and then they changed their mind, they got buyer's remorse, and now they're on Trump's side.
Well, that's why you can't. That's why you can't trust them. I mean, they're. I mean, again, this is another reason I'm gaining sympathy for Marxism is because, this class of people, they have no principles. They have like absolutely no value. Anything that I'm trying to do or you're trying to do has they have no value for that. I mean, they're just there. They just follow the wind. Whatever. They have no principles.
They're
So
opportunists,
yeah.
absolutely,
So
fully. Yep.
so yeah, but I don't
But
understand the.
Eastman is a little different. Eastman's a little different, meaning he might be dangerous in a different way. He might be
Oh yeah.
dangerous as an ideologue.
Yeah, I agree with that. but I don't
right?
think.
But
But
then we need to know what the ideology is.
well, yeah, but I think I do know what the ideology is, and I think the vast majority of constitutional scholars they say that that's just that's. I mean, we have emails of him talking to other conservative legal scholars, and they're like, this
Yep.
doesn't make any sense. Like, what are you doing?
Right.
And when you say there's like their claims of the election, I understand we can take these all as political claims, meaning they're not
Right.
right they're not true or false necessarily.
Right.
But
Right.
if we untangle them, we can see like there isn't any evidence that the election was stolen. Like it's all just
Oh
either.
yeah, yeah. No, no, of course. Right.
But
No, no, I know. Of
so
course.
yeah, but I mean it's
Right.
just like why do you not think there's a substantive difference? Because it seems to me that there is a clear substantive difference in the level of like claims and lying on one side versus the other. There is a substantive difference. And so I'm still not sure why, and I think this is why a lot of people have discomfort with
Oh,
what you
because
say.
The Trump people, they kind of lied and they didn't lie. Meaning Eastman is different from, I don't know, Rudy Giuliani
Oh,
or
of
Sidney
course.
Powell in court,
Yeah.
right? So, I think that Eastman is a good window onto things. Which is to say, okay, they're going to play hardball, we should play hardball too. And also, he wasn't in a position to do it,
Right.
meaning he could only offer a tactic to the Trump people, and then they had to do it or not do it,
Right.
right? And the thing is that they kind of did it and kind of didn't do it, meaning at the end of the day, they kind of didn't do it, and
Sure.
so instead it became, well, he's responsible for the suicide of a cop after January 6th because John Eastman wrote this memo
Well, yeah, but
and
I'm
encouraged.
not saying that. I don't care about that.
No, no,
That's
I know.
all. Yeah, that's all noise. I just want to argue on the really substantive, legal principled grounds. Which, yeah, I'm not fully convinced that those don't matter, but I do understand.
I might be unclear on that myself about the so-called fake electors. My sense is that, like, having alternate electors ready in case Congress wanted to dispute this or that state's election returns is just what you'd have to do in order to be able to act on an exigent circumstance. Meaning, if you could get, like, Congress and state officials and a state legislature to say, you know what, no,
Right.
this election was not right, then you do need a quote unquote fake electors. I mean, they did this in the 1800 Jeffersonian Revolution, which, is ancient history, and yet,
I mean, it
and they were
matters. Yeah.
also ready to launch a civil war over it, the Jeffersonians, right? So they were, I mean, there have been hinky elections that were
True.
decided by Congress, and, it was 1876. There's all sorts of things that have gone on. And I think that they were honestly thinking it could be like that. And there is precedent for it.
I think I don't want to turn this whole thing. I want to talk about other things. I don't want to just talk about the Eastman memo and the fake
No, no, but
election.
it's
But
on a principled level. I think that the gamesmanship, right? The extreme gamesmanship, the political gamesmanship. Um, and probably, look, they knew that they were taking some risks,
oh, they definitely knew. Yeah. I mean, I think Eastman even
right?
said like the Supreme Court is likely to overturn this. Like this is, I think he admitted that himself. So
Right. And I think that that's where the question of criminal intent comes in, meaning, were they intending to do a crime or were they intending to, you know, take a marginally constitutional action
yeah,
that could be reversed or challenged, or, people could go along with it or they could not go along with it. Right. That's why I wouldn't call it a coup.
sure. I think the
Right.
substantive difference, because I have dug into this a lot. The conservatives like to cite Alaska or Hawaii. No, it was Hawaii in the Nixon election, I think. The for the
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they like
Yep.
to cite cases like that. But there's a substantive difference here because you're mentioning that people like to have alternate electors, and that's what they call them. But the substantive
Yes.
difference here is that Eastman wasn't saying let's have backup electors, and then if it's certified that the election was stolen, we can use them. That's not what he said. What he said was Mike Pence is going to unilaterally declare the election fraudulent. This seems to me like directly opposite to the spirit of the Constitution. I mean, the spirit of the Constitution says if you have if the executive can solely decide the status of the election, then you just have like Rome corrupt
Oh yeah,
oligarchy.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It
No,
seems
no, right.
directly
It came down
contrary.
to Pence. It came down to Pence, and it came down to Pence as president of the Senate, not as vice president of the executive. I mean, it came down to that role. It did come down to, okay, well, we can, and then the motivation's complicated too, because they also were like, maybe we should give these lawsuits more time,
Right.
delay certification of the election in order to allow things to play out in the courts, right? So a kind of delaying tactic. I mean, you know, let's put it this way. I'm surprised that the Democrats didn't put up more resistance to Trump's reelection.
Yeah, me
And
too.
I thought surely they're going to do everything they possibly can. And if he had not won the popular vote, they might have.
Yeah.
So they weren't in a position to, like, let's say that they had gotten a congressional majority, but Trump got the Electoral College.
Right.
I think that there's a likelihood that they would have tried to deny certification of the election of Trump. They certainly established all sorts of legal grounds for it. That's what getting him convicted was about. Quote unquote legal. Not exactly legal, more PR. So for me, when I speak to someone like you and when I think it for myself, I am kind of like, oh, this is extraordinary. This is crazy. But I'm also thinking, okay, this is the seams of the system showing. It's like the presidential immunity, if I could just mention that. I think two things kind of happened. One is that there absolutely was presidential immunity. There was. And yet the Supreme Court like institutionalized it and also qualified it in a way that I think is a change. Meaning not they said he doesn't have absolute immunity. He only has some immunity. And I thought, well, basically, up till that point, it was just understood that there's presidential immunity to a certain extent, meaning the only remedy is impeachment, that the remedy is not criminal prosecution, right? But the remedy is impeachment. Namely, there's only a political remedy, there isn't a criminal legal remedy. And therefore, they were, that the presidents were immune. Whereas now they're saying, well, for some things, yes, for other things, no. And so and so what you'll get is like the progressive liberals are like, oh, well, the conservative Supreme Court granted him an immunity that he didn't have in the Constitution, whereas I think he absolutely did, meaning every president did. It's like core to the whole system, and yet it wasn't going to be tested. So that you mentioned the word norms earlier. Norms, right? Or is it legal norms or is it political norms? And if we're living in a time of the violation of political norms, we should be paying attention to that too. Right? And that's a little bit different than abrogation of legal norms. Because I think legal norms are contestable, meaning prosecutors are elected, like that's still politically contestable. And so I think, okay, are we talking about political norms? And that to me is the more interesting question. Like, why are the political norms fraying?
Sure.
Right? Because you could say both parties have violated political norms in terms of things that Trump has attempted, things that the Democrats have attempted in this era. That they weren't going to prosecute George W. Bush for war crimes, the Obama administration. That Obama was never going to be prosecuted for drone striking an American citizen. That was never going to happen. Whereas now it's fair game. And I think that that's the thing. It's not about what any particular actor is doing. It's about the norms coming apart. Right? So again, what we mentioned earlier. Trump's not the cause. It's a symptom, and the symptom is widespread. It's focused around Trump, but it's widespread.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess I just see my role as very different because what I want to do is I want to find what is the truth and like what is the principle behind all these things. Because I'm not a progressive. I don't agree with the establishment. I hate basically all journalists. I think these people have no principles. They're just there. They're all talking
Right.
about how they're applauding themselves for exposing Joe Biden now that Trump is in office. It's like, if you really felt that way, you should have done it before, and now you should
Right.
be holding Trump accountable if that's your job, and you're just doing
Right.
nothing. So I see myself very much as trying to find out, like, what is the actual principle? What are the actual principles that matter? Because if it is the case that both parties have violated these things, I think we need to figure out what matters and what do we need to uphold in order to stabilize society. That's really what I want to do. And so,
Mm.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's very difficult to reconcile those things when you have a different priority. Obviously, you're not trying to uphold the capitalist order. So,
No, I mean, one could say, because I would be sympathetic to the idea that short of overthrowing capitalism, that we should struggle to uphold liberal values as much as possible, the values of liberal democracy as much as possible. Absolutely. And so again, then it just becomes a matter of how do we do that? Meaning, what are the means for doing that? So I thought, and it gets very tactical very quickly, by the way. It gets very minute in terms of detail. Like I was sympathetic to AOC calling for, civil disobedience against deportation,
right,
you know. But I don't think that, tactically maybe it would be the best thing to try to, I don't know what, dox particular like border patrol agents or ICE people, to personally dox people, that would not be the tactic that I think would be most effective at the level of civil disobedience, you so, but I do think, um, civil disobedience meaning breaking the law in order to take a principled stand, in order to make a political point in the face of actions being taken. I'm fully sympathetic to that. And then it would be, criminal cases, but it would be in the court of public opinion. I mean, the sad part is how much is done administratively in a way that really cuts out any kind of public discursive aspect, you know? Instead, it's just poll testing, you know? Like, it's like, oh, how's Trump handling immigration? Do you approve or disapprove? Like, it's some
yeah,
bullshit. Whereas I feel like, it should come down to, like, I don't know, randomly selected 12 jurors deciding whether the government has a case or not. I mean, I don't know, call me old fashioned, you know? I don't think it should just be legal sophistry in appeals court.
okay, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Well, moving on from that a little bit to more fundamental, like, I guess digging into what our fundamental differences are. I wanted to talk a little bit about what you think, because I think a lot of people, like on the Marxist like internet, there's kind of like this little corner, and everyone's just a Marxist, and everyone just kind of agrees that they're a Marxist, but then they
Uh-huh.
just fight amongst each other. The famous leftist infighting, I guess.
Right.
But what I really want to know is the thing that isn't really spoken about is, and I think the answer to this question can actually reveal the differences you have with other Marxists too.
Yeah.
But like, really, I want to know fundamentally why, because I think you and I come from the same tradition in like a very far off fundamental sense. So why do you think that I'm wrong or people of my tradition are wrong, and why are you a Marxist? Why is that where you align yourself? However you want to. There could be multiple answers to that question, and I just want to know why you think that. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that um, classical liberalism is, we could say the highest consciousness about society and rights and politics that has been achieved, in fact. And that what we've been dealing with the last 200 years is the crisis of that framework and that self understanding. So, at a practical level and at a theoretical level, we've been dealing with the limits and also the objective undermining of liberal democracy, of bourgeois society, and its conception of politics and the state and representative democracy, etc.
Right.
And I think generally people on the left and on the right tend to hypothesize things and fetishize things to such a degree that they take issue with this or that. It's like, oh, well, the US Constitution is undemocratic or something like that. I reject that. I think that no, it's a high expression of a historical progress, and that the backsliding on it is not just out of a kind of corruption and depravity, but is really more objectively conditioned in terms of capitalism. So I think that we want to be good liberals, but that objectively society makes it impossible. And yet, necessarily, we have to uphold those values nonetheless.
Right.
And I see the struggle for socialism coming out of that, right? Coming out of you have to fight for liberal democratic rights, reach the limits of those in practice in order to have a case for socialism.
Right.
And I think that that happened and the case was made a long time ago. And then it got shunted into this other domain, which is policy differences within the state that can have a massive effect. However, don't really solve the problem that they purport to. So they can have a massive positive, negative effect. You know, positive, something is changed. Negative are all sorts of downsides, unanticipated, and all sorts of social pathology results that we then have to sort of ignore.
Right.
Um, but so in that respect, I'm more sympathetic to conservative liberals than to progressive liberals because progressive liberals are like, well, modern society, technology, mass politics, mass society, mass culture. This is just what we got to do. Whereas the conservative liberals are like, do we really have to do that? Actually, right? Shouldn't we stand on principle and not just give in to this necessity that may or may not be necessary? This purported necessity. So in some ways, I would say that there is a conservative liberal case for socialism specifically. And I would also say that Marxism has a firm grounding there in terms of the working class, meaning the working class's sense of what's right and wrong, what's justified, what's unjustified, society and the state, all these things, as opposed to taking a ruling class perspective on a more of a technocratic solution on this policy or that policy. Right. So there is a conservative liberalism to the working class in its social political struggles, including passively just voting with its feet, that I think is also the basis for any possible struggle for socialism. I don't think that it's a matter of like intellectuals figuring things out
Right.
and then imposing it. I don't think that historical Marxism thought that at all. I think it's become that, it's become kind of perverted into that uh, in the last 100 years, but that really wasn't the point. So again, I'll cite Chomsky because he does have this notion that like Marxism became an ideology of the coordinator class,
Yeah.
and it's about the intellectuals like ruling over the workers. And I feel like okay, descriptively that's true, but that Marxism never intended that, and actually was quite aware of that danger and possibility, and distinguished itself actively from that. So, in that way, I guess that would be Chomsky's point with respect to Lenin, that Lenin's a right deviationist. He has this kind of statist conception of socialism or whatever, right?
Right.
One man management in firms and this kind of thing, right? I know, Chomsky's very smart and, it's all very plausible. I just think it's actually deeper. It's actually a deeper problem. And so that's where I think that I'm not a liberal because I realize that to be a liberal, one would have to actively avoid dealing with some issues of capitalism that have long been manifest and that continue to make themselves felt. Right. So that's where now the political consequences of that are very unclear because again, I think the older tradition of Marxism politically has been buried thoroughly. And so now we just have varieties of a kind of bureaucratic, technocratic mentality. But basically it's like reforms of capitalism justified with quote unquote Marxism,
Right.
right? So a kind of elision of the difference between a progressive capitalist and a Marxist socialist perspective. And again, that's where I feel like, well, the conservative liberals have had a point then for a while now. You know, that
Yeah.
has to be reckoned with, has to be taken seriously.
So, along those lines, this is like kind of a more brief question, but it could be a big subject. The way I conceive of like kind of the anti-colonial movement is I call it kind of a leap, because I think that I think it's understandable and it makes sense and it can be justified how you get from Marx to that, but I don't
Yeah.
think it's necessary. I don't think it's necessarily built within Marx that you support all the different directions that anti-colonialism took. And so I think like how you justify that leap is like an interesting question, because it seems like you're very skeptical of that. You're very
Oh yeah.
against a lot of that. But
Yeah.
at the same time, Lenin was one of the ones who started to go in that direction. From what I understand, he had
Seems
an
to open the door to it. Yeah.
yeah, he had an interest in like the nationalism question, where he
Hmm.
said he said that being a free nation is a form of democracy, and that is desirable in sort of a liberal way, I guess, supporting your point
Hmm.
for liberal
Hmm.
Lenin's liberalism there. And whereas
Hmm.
Rosa Luxemburg actually strongly disagreed with that, she thought that that was one of their disagreements. But
Hmm.
regardless, it seems like Lenin did agree with that to some extent. So where do you think the lines are drawn as far as anti-colonialism and Marxism and that leap? And yeah, what do you think about that?
Right. So it has to do with, you know, starting most manifestly with World War One, but also prior to that. Um, things that are uncomfortable to talk about, like the Boer War. Well, the Boers fighting an anti-imperialist struggle against British imperialism. Yeah, they were, right? The people who eventually gave us apartheid.
Right,
And after all, the British imperialists said that they were defending the rights of black Africans against the Boers in that war. And yet, for Marxists at the time, there was a real question of maybe one should be sympathetic to the Boers against the British imperialists. And after all, look at how the British imperialists treat the Boers. They're setting up concentration camps. They're killing tens of thousands of them. You know, so I think that it's complicated because clearly the crisis of capitalism in the early 20th century was bound up with the crisis of colonial empires,
right,
right? So there was a political crisis that was manifest leading up to World War One, and then in World War One and its aftermath. And then, of course, the 20th century, you had new kind of colonialism between the wars. You had these protectorates set up in the Middle East with the French and the British. You had the French and the British taking over former German colonial domains. And then after World War II, you had, anti-colonialism, decolonization. You had official United Nations decolonization,
right,
except for the one supposed exception, Israel, right? And so, in many ways, the whole anti-Zionist, Palestinian solidarity struggle could just be seen as trying to implement the original UN vision from the 1940s. The original Allies conception coming out of World War II. I just think that a lot gets jumbled up there. And Woodrow Wilson and Lenin both favored the breakup of the colonial empires.
right,
Right. And so at the time, it was Wilson's piece versus Lenin's piece, meaning Wilson's piece is about creating the League of Nations and a framework of, a global system of states of liberal democracies. And Lenin is for world proletarian socialist revolution. Neither of those could come true, if you will, meaning both of them are utopias, perhaps. Um, and maybe neither of them really meant it. Meaning, did Woodrow Wilson really mean this to be the case, or was he a racist? He was. And so did he assume that, of course, there was going to be some subjugation tutelage of the colonial world in one form or another,
Right.
right? Would it mean supporting tin pot dictatorships in the former colonies? Yeah, he probably thought so. And that's what we got,
Right.
right? And so, but again, unpacking that phenomenon and recognizing that there is conservative anti-colonialism. There's conservative liberal anti-colonialism. There's Hobson, right, who saw a connection between overseas empire and domestic political domination by capitalism. So he was like a liberal Democrat, anti-imperialist, and around the Boer War in particular, and a kind of reactionary anti-imperialism. Now, the Luxembourg versus Lenin point is perhaps a little bit more obscure and has a lot to do with the Russian Empire in particular,
Right.
which is that she anticipated that the breakup of the Russian Empire under the auspices of national self-determination was itself an imperialist capitalist
Mm-hmm.
plan. And those were the terms in which the Prussian Empire fought the war on the Eastern Front in World War One. They said that they were liberating the peoples from Tsarism.
Right.
They did, right? And so Luxembourg was like, "Yeah, we can't be part of that." She also objected to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that
Right.
Lenin signed with the Germans because she saw it as caving into German imperialism. So she looked at things that way, and Lenin, on the other hand, said, "Well, of course that could be the case, but then it's up to us to translate it into socialist revolution." And that in the meantime, on principle, it is the case that people are robbed of their democratic rights
Mm-hmm.
in this political subjugation to colonial or quasi-colonial empire.
Right.
So I think they were both right about that.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think that though the issue really is Luxembourg versus Lenin, I think the issue is really Wilson versus Lenin. I think it's Woodrow Wilson versus Lenin. And again, from our standpoint, we have to regard them both as being utopians who had some unrealistic vision or didn't really mean it.
Right.
Meaning, Lenin didn't really mean to create a world of like ex-colonial nation states. He meant to establish the global dictatorship of the proletariat,
Mm-hmm.
but that would respect as needed the democratic rights against national oppression of whoever wanted to struggle to claim those rights. So he didn't just want a capitalist world system of nation states. He did not.
Of
Now
course.
you could say Wilson did, but also Wilson didn't, meaning he certainly didn't want capitalism in the way that Marxists understand capitalism. Right? He just thought in the nature of progress, there's this kind of slow turning of the historical wheel. There are backwards people, there are advanced people. Within countries, there are people who are more advanced versus people who are more backwards. Wilson is on the right, Lenin is on the left. So Wilson's is a reactionary utopia, whereas Lenin's is a socialist utopia. And I think we have to struggle with that socialist utopia. Because when we look at what we want from the world in an ongoing way in the future, what kind of world do we want to be moving towards? I don't think that we want to be moving towards Woodrow Wilson's world, but we might be wanting to move towards Lenin's world of a cosmopolitan, egalitarian world in which people are not nationally oppressed and in which the problem of capitalism can be overcome.
Right.
Right? So the challenge is distinguishing Lenin's perspective from a progressive liberal perspective, from a League of Nations perspective, or from a United Nations Charter perspective.
Yeah, it seems like, and then involved in that, it seems like your objection to a lot of the anti-colonial movements that did exist, whether it's like Arab nationalism or whatever it is that they set aside the struggle for socialism. That they
Yes.
that's really the fundamental thing, is that that wasn't their priority anymore. Whereas I guess you would
Right.
say that Lenin's priority was that.
Yes, absolutely. In other words, he was against nationalism.
Right.
He was for national self-determination against national oppression.
Right.
And, did he think that that meant exercising the right to secession? He said not always. And maybe just having that right be respected will prevent it from being exercised, right? That if people feel that they have the right, like really, truly, then they will voluntarily associate rather than secede.
Right.
And it's a very optimistic view. I mean, the left is defined by its optimism, by its faith in, if people are given the actual opportunity, that they will exercise their rights well. And then the only question is, well, what are the circumstances under which people are prevented from exercising their rights well? Capitalism. And where people are driven against each other in various ways. And certainly that is taken advantage of by people who have an interest in the status quo,
Right.
you know. But no, I mean, Lenin was extremely optimistic in a way that's painful for us now. Right. And I think challenges our imagination in terms of when we start to think about what would be a just set of circumstances, what would be, a good framework within which people's rights could be observed. Right. Because again, Marxism would raise the question of how, even if we came up with the perfect system, capitalism would pervert it. And doesn't just mean the interests of rich people.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It means there's more of an objective social problem that would express itself,
Right.
and that would ruin the intention of the liberal democratic reforms.
Yeah. Okay, so another, this is like a separate question, but it touches on some of the things we've just been talking about. Actually, before I found you, I found Daniel Tutt, actually.
Sure.
And
Yeah, I know him.
yeah, and I enjoyed listening to him because it was a more thorough articulation, but it was more in line of what I had my impression of Marxism already was. It was more in line with that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I saw him talk to Doug from Sublation, and then they
Right.
mentioned you. You were like the specter, the ghost in the background. So I wanted to go listen to you
Right. Uh-huh.
and find out what was going on there. And then this was like right around the time when you actually spoke to Daniel, and that was obviously very exciting for me to see that
Mm-hmm.
happen. So I wanted to just know, like, what is your kind of meta perspective on how that conversation went and how you feel about having conversations with people on that side?
Oh, I thought it went very well. I thought that we got to articulate our differences very clearly. We could have elaborated them more, of course.
Right.
But I think that, he raised objections that I was able to answer. You know, I mean, I think there would still be, like I said, a lot left to clarify, but nonetheless, I thought it was a good moment. And I think that, yeah, I mean, Daniel generally has more of a standard Marxist leftist perspective, meaning he inherits much more unproblematically than I can a kind of 20th century tradition of Marxism.
Right.
So he sort of accepts a lot of assumptions that I would not about Marxism and about politics and about society. Um, but again, I think that we touched on it, he and I, about like that he thought I was, endorsing Bonapartism.
Yeah.
And again, we've you and I have talked about it now. What a dialectical approach to Bonapartism would be, meaning recognizing it as a pathology, as a problem, but also recognizing its historical necessity at the same time, rather than treating it as like a moral question of good or bad acts,
Right.
right? And I think that's just difficult because also we're living in a world where there isn't an alternative actor,
Yeah.
meaning we are thrown into the position of being spectators on something that we have little or nothing to do with and have virtually no power over. And I think that that's painful to acknowledge that, one is honestly trying to work through things and think about things, but it has no consequence really, in practice. But that's the position that we're in. And
Yeah.
I think that we can we can fool ourselves into thinking that our own thought process is more consequential by imagining that if we understand things, then somehow we make things more reasonable, just in that very act.
Right.
And I think no, I think we're dealing with a lot of opaque and irrational stuff. And where it is more like naked power struggle and opportunism, and with a very loose connection to any kind of notion of principle, on the part of the actors. You know, um, it's super tricky. So I think that the leftism for me and Marxism certainly should not be a more extreme partisanship within capitalist politics. And I think that's what it becomes. It becomes like, okay, I'm going to give an elaborate theoretical justification and be hyper partisan on what is essentially a progressive capitalist point.
Right.
Right. And I don't think that it should be that, on a variety of levels. I don't think that politics should be understood so ideologically, nor do I think that Marxism should be debased to that, to serve that role. And so I think that that's where, Daniel and I've had, personal dialogue as well as that podcast, and we'll probably have more public dialogue, where I think that there's a lot of sympathy, in fact, but we do have some different understandings of things. I
Absolutely.
think that he would be less comfortable than I would in really putting everything into question. I think everything is up for question. All bets are off
Right.
where we are now.
Yeah, I think I was like in listening to that. Yeah, it's kind of funny because it is very clear where your differences are, and you have very substantive differences. But there's also a lot of like commonality, I think, in
Yeah.
the way that you're very skeptical of the way things are, and I think those are important things that you both share. Is that you're more lucidly dealing with where you're at. But what I'm wondering about is you're put in a very difficult position there because on one
Mm-hmm.
hand you have to like be able to fight against those tendencies from your perspective because you really have to clarify things. If you're going to even begin to unbury the left, you have to really fight against those things. But at the same time, if you don't, speak to those people, or if you don't consider them allies in some respect, then you're like really lost. I mean, the amount of people who are on your side is like so thin. So the way you deal with that, is it just kind of what you mentioned in talking to him? You just want to talk to these people and just talk to them and just deal with your differences, but you're on the same side, or how do you deal with that like tension of like resolving that?
It is a tension. I mean, what I'd say is that for one reason or another, um, I have found an audience without actively seeking one. Meaning, I was happy to, write what I wrote, think what I think, say what I say, and maybe nobody's going to agree with me. Fine. And maybe no one's really going to even be able to engage it or comprehend it at all. Fine. But it turns out, no. Uh, Whether or not people really, adequately understand where I'm coming from and adequately engage it, fine. But they try. And so there's productive dialogue
Right.
to be had. And, there's something about my perspective that people can't entirely ignore. And I think, okay, well, that's doing something. Whether I'm right or wrong, it might serve a productive role. It will help people think that I am provoking people to think, and that's something,
Mm-hmm.
you know. Um, and so, that can justify that kind of conversation or dialogue. Um, so, I have modest goals, but I do have goals, and mostly of a negative character. And the negative character is getting people to let go of certain dogmatisms that are inherited from the past. or at least recognizing them as such. Whether they can really let go of them is something else. And I've myself undergone that process as a leftist. I started out with a lot of dogmatic assumptions, and then I've, learned to let go of them over a very long period of time. And in so doing, I've learned some other things along the way, and I've learned to appreciate things that in the past I would have either been unaware of or not paid close attention to. Like I mentioned, conservative liberalism. I
Right.
think I would have started out as a leftist and just been like, oh, yeah, that's just bullshit.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, but it's plausible bullshit. It might be bullshit, but it's plausible bullshit, and it might have a kernel of truth.
Right.
So I think that insofar as I myself have gone through such a process, I can model other people going through such a process, which I do think is necessary and will be helpful.
Right. Um, I also wanted to ask you. This is like a kind of a very specific question, but there's that
Hmm.
that Kolakowski. He wrote "Main Currents of Marxism,"
Hmm.
and I just generally wanted to know what you think of that book, I guess, and what he wrote.
I mean, that Kolakowski, I think, is a little bit of an intemperate screed, is what I'd call it. Um, he was a very intelligent guy, and I like a lot of things that he wrote. Um, there's one essay in particular from his early history, The Concept of the Left,
Right.
where he was still a Marxist, we could say, as opposed to Main Currents in Marxism, where he's very anti-Marxist, very. And I feel like in the two volumes, right, the worst chapters are around the people who I think are the most important, namely Lenin, Lukács, and Adorno,
Okay.
are the most greedy chapters, and where he just expresses his complete lack of sympathy for and contempt even for Lukács and Adorno.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when he met Lukács, maybe Lukács had already compromised too much with Stalinism, and so I can kind of understand it.
Yeah.
And but that he couldn't make sense of Adorno, I think said a lot. And then poor Lenin, you know, and so I do think that that is that's his masterwork, if you will, on Marxism.
Right.
But I think it's deeply unfortunate. I don't think that it's some kind of good history of Marxism or something, or good analysis of Marxism. I think it's a screed. Um, I mean, like I said, he's a smart guy, and he wrote other things contemporaneously and after that are interesting and good. On all sorts of subjects, including on like religion and existentialism, and he's got a wonderful book criticizing analytic philosophy, logical positivism.
Oh
Not
yeah.
the same thing, but that's also really good. But main currents in Marxism, yeah, I kind of wish it didn't exist.
Okay. Fair enough. Um, one of the lads this is like of personal interest to me, but I wanted to talk to you about
Hmm.
India a little bit.
Hmm.
Because one of the things there's this I don't know if you've heard of Vivek Chibber. I don't know if you've heard
Yeah,
of. Yeah.
of
So
course.
I was reading kind of like some debates he was having with the book that he wrote about subaltern um, studies, and
Hmm.
obviously he was very critical of that. And there was a lot of very obscure, like very specific Marxist disagreement in that. And one of the main core of that book, I think, really is that he wants to uphold the idea that there's a universalizing like drive of capitalism that's universal,
Hmm.
whereas
Hmm.
the people in subaltern studies they're saying there's something very unique to India, and then this happened, and then this happened, and he really wants to unpack that and reverse that. So I was just wondering, what do you think about India? I guess to the extent that you do think about it, and I assume you would agree with the idea that there's a universalizing drive of capitalism, and they're suffering from the same framework. But I do wonder, like, how you think about that, or yeah, that question.
Right. So it's so a friend of mine, Sunit Singh, wrote a critical review of Chipper, um, in which he also criticizes the subalternists,
Yeah.
but also defends their honor against Chibber's attack.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that that's kind of where I land. Now, so unpacking that history. So India is a place where Marxism had a very strong ideological presence, even though it wasn't really in power. I guess more recently, in certain states, the Communist Party is in power, right? But that history also of a internal disintegration of Marxism, a lot of internal conflict in Marxism. So you had Moscow line
Yeah.
Stalinism versus Maoism, and then you had different flavors of Maoism,
Yeah.
right? And then there was Trotskyism also, because Trotskyism tends to do well in the English speaking world and in the Spanish speaking world. Why? Because the Western Hemisphere and England and Oceania were spared Nazi occupation, right? And so the Trotskyists survived there as opposed to other places in Europe, for example. Um, so I think that the subalternists rejected a form of Marxism that was Stalinist. And then Chibber is in the unhappy position of having to reject their version of Marxism without himself falling back into Stalinism,
Right.
right? And where he might think that actually theirs was a Stalinist opposition to Stalinism.
Mm-hmm.
So you see how convoluted it gets,
Yeah. Absolutely.
unfortunately,
Yeah.
right? Um, and he himself, I think, is from a Maoist background, his family in India,
Yeah.
right? And so he doesn't like subalternism and post-colonialism because he thinks it gives rise to identity politics, which he thinks is the great bane of the left.
Yeah. For sure.
Um, Again, though, like we mentioned earlier, there's a question of cause and effect, right? Meaning, is identity politics the cause or is it the effect? And if it's the effect, what is it the effect of? Well, it clearly is the effect of a certain kind of leftist failure. And so it's not like, okay, so there's like, I don't know, universalism, relativism, or universalism, particularism, some kind of antinomy going on there, where he wants to uphold universalism against either relativism or particularism. Okay, sounds good. But universalism per se, can you uphold universalism per se? This is where I'm an Adorno-ite,
Right.
which is that socialism would be about overcoming capitalist universalism, right? So I think that he put it as, freedom would be neither a totality nor a contradiction, right? So it would mean overcoming the totality and the universality of bourgeois society, fulfilling it maybe, but also negating it, transcending it, and would actually free the particular in a way that's different from particularism as it manifests in
Right.
capitalism, right? So it's kind of like it's the usual universality versus universalism,
Mm-hmm.
particularity versus particularism, individuality versus individualism, and collectivity versus collectivism. I think it's important that in capitalism, we're faced with essentially fragmentation where you're either an individualist or a collectivist. You're a universalist or you're a particularist.
Right.
And I think that we should hold on to the idea that that's a false choice and that the aim should be something else. Now, I think it's easy to argue against particularist politics, especially with respect to India, especially with Hindutva, BJP, Modi, you know. India obviously has a great deal of internal divisions. And the anti-Muslim stuff that Modi is associated with throughout his political career is obviously really bad. It's toxic. There is Hindu fascism.
Yeah.
There is, you know? And so, And then there's the question of the Indian project. In other words, wasn't post-colonial India fated to have these problems? Isn't capitalist India inevitably going to have these problems? So again, I think that it comes back to the question of socialism, which I think it does for Chibber as well. But I think that I would my caveat, I would generally be sympathetic
Hmm.
to where he's coming from. But my caveat would be, but what does that mean now in practice? Does that just mean that you're nostalgic for Congress, the Congress Party?
Yeah.
You know, is that what we're talking about in the face of the BJP? In which case it's just not worth it. Like then you're using Marxism for something else. Now, as far as the left is concerned, like a socialist movement in the United States, I'm sure that Chibber and I would agree on a lot of things in terms of we'd be against the breaking up of the movement along identitarian political lines.
Right.
So we would find a lot of common cause there. We would. But at an intellectual level, I feel like he's forced into a kind of crude opposition,
Yeah. I see
you
what you
know?
mean. Yeah.
Yeah. Meaning there was a point and there might still remain a point to the subalternists and to post-colonialism. Especially because post-colonialism was not anti-colonialism. It was not decolonization. It was something else.
Right.
Meaning it was a critique of nationalism. It was an acknowledgement that decolonization and anti-colonialism was not only inadequate, but really was the problem. Right. So post-colonialism, I feel like that's become a super obscure issue,
Yeah.
because nowadays it's just, again, universalism, particularism, decolonization, you know, like, again, what would that mean?
Yeah.
You know, um, I mean, just to tie it back to something that was mentioned earlier, we can't ignore the fact that Arab nationalism failed and that the Palestinian struggle failed under Arab nationalist leadership and necessarily gave way to Islamism,
Hmm.
right? That doesn't mean Islamism is good, but it does mean that we're not going to restore the supposed universalism of Arab nationalism as opposed to the particularism of Islamism, especially because Islamism is fighting its own battle of universalism, right?
Right.
So it's 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 not nationalist also out of a kind of anti-particularism
Yeah. There's
of its
actually
own.
there's actually a book I was reading. It was called Arab Political Thought, I think, and it was very
Mm-hmm.
much it was very sympathetic. It was about Arab political thought in general, but it mentioned a lot of
Right.
Marxism, and it seemed very it was very much trying to untangle that. Like, how do we
Yes.
understand and move on from both Islamism
Yes.
and Arab nationalism, and trying it seemed trying to recover a lot of ideas that you would be very sympathetic to.
I think I
Among
know the book you're talking about. It's actually an old book, isn't it?
no, I think it's like it came out, or maybe it is actually. I don't know. I'm not sure. I'll be honest. I'm not sure. I don't remember. It's been a few months.
Or it might be a recent book that harks back to there was a thinker, and I'm forgetting his name now, from the 70s
Yeah, it
who
is.
mounted.
It does reference that one. It's something different. Yeah.
Right. Right. So I am yes, I think that we need to remember those things. We can't, like, really, so much is memory hold,
Yeah.
in a way that I find, frightening. Because I do think that the critiques that we would want to mount now probably have been made in the past. And, we shouldn't just reinvent the wheel
Right.
because it's possible that people in the past had a clearer apprehension of things than we might, going on the way things appear to us now.
Yeah. Okay. I have one last question, if I can, to end here to really
Hmm.
tie it all together. So, if you're talking to someone like me, what is your what is your sales pitch? How do you market to people? Do you even think it's necessary? Is it just like good luck, we'll see what happens, or do you have like fundamental points that you would emphasize for me to consider? I guess.
Right. So I would say, of course, I think that the Marxist tradition should be taken seriously, intellectually.
Right.
In terms of politically now, um, I do think that we're in a moment where there's a serious crisis of politics that also appears to be related to a crisis in society, but that the nature of that social crisis is very obscure now. And therefore, there's only a loose connection between the two. It's not like you can read off from the political crisis or from the partisanship that you can read like those substantial divisions in society out of that partisanship in capitalist politics. I don't think that we can do that. And so I would say that we're in a time, a pessimistic time, where perhaps we are neglecting all sorts of social resources that might exist but are underutilized. There might be potential in society that's being wasted, and that people are, groping towards with like religion, and they're sort of there are these gestures in this direction, but I think it's very impoverished.
Yeah.
You know, uh, so I think it's a time of stepping back and trying to be open-minded and learn about the world that we're living in now. I was recently in a debate where I raised sociology and political science, and I kind of needled my interlocutors, and I said, yeah, Adorno would say these are reified disciplines.
Yeah.
At the same time, I would say they're gutted disciplines, meaning not that long ago, you were able to ask substantial questions in the realm of sociology or in political science that are not even asked now.
Right.
That everything is just turned into a quantifiable statistical phenomenon. And so I do think that it cries out for a more qualitative approach and a more theoretical approach and more substantial thinking.
Yeah.
Which, again, that's where, of course, I'm sympathetic to the desire for principles in the realm of politics. But again, I think that we'd have to think about the substance of those principles, meaning, on what basis can we claim these principles? Can we claim the rights
Mm-hmm.
that we would claim? And my own approach to these things is, I've approached it through Marxism, and I've used it to open up everything for reconsideration, including just the nature of modern society, older bourgeois thought, classical liberalism, the Enlightenment. I think that all the ways that people kind of had a pat answer to this history or classified things, is it liberalism? Is it republicanism? Like, what is it? The way that these things have been neatly parsed out, I think that we have to throw all that away and really reconsider things fresh.
Right.
And not take any assumptions for granted.
Right.
So, but in terms of activism, I mean, what I like to say is on an activist front, I'm involved in something that I started called the Campaign for a Socialist Party. But I've been very clear that any kind of social activism, the kind of civil social action that one can take, is essentially going to be liberal and even anarchist in its character, and
Right.
that's all for the good. Meaning that I think that we need to be thinking about possibilities that are not dependent on the state, that are not dependent immediately on changes in administrative policy or law. We need to be operating in the gray area, where things happen only in a quasi legal or quasi administrative way at best, and maybe outside of that entirely. So I think that a lot of like activism is stuck with a kind of state orientation. Whether through electoral politics or just through pressure on administrative government, in a way that I think has left a lot by the wayside that we need to re-engage now.
Yeah.
I think that what's needed is not something that immediately translates into the partisanship of capitalist politics. So at a very basic level, I'd welcome a rejuvenation of liberalism in civil society. Because again, the way I understand these things is a socialist movement could only be properly motivated in and through that kind of a movement and it reaching its practical limits. So, it would have to come motivated by a desire for similar goals.
Yeah.
And I don't think many people on the left even begin to think that way. The anarchists sometimes, like we started with Chomsky, we can end on Chomsky. That Chomsky will say he's not a liberal in the sense of liberalism, but he has a lot of sympathy and finds a lot of insight in classical liberal thought.
Yeah.
And I think Marxists forgot that was also true for Marx. And I think that even liberals tend to be beholden to liberalism
Right.
in a way that we need to disabuse ourselves of what has become of classical liberal thought in the modern capitalist world. It's been distorted, it's been perverted, it's been hollowed out, it's been reified, and maybe we could rethink it.
Yeah. I think that's a really good place to end, especially where you mentioned bringing in more qualitative analysis and theory, because really that's what I want to do here, and that's just kind of how I think about things in general. Is I really want to
Mm-hmm.
understand the theoretical fundamental underpinnings, and even if you and I are approaching it from a different perspective, I think we can absolutely agree on those fundamental tenets. And so I think that's really good. I really appreciate that, and I really appreciate you coming on for my first episode of this, whatever this is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah,
Cool.
I really appreciate you being here. Is there anything else you want to leave on there?
Um, so if anyone, is curious about, my thinking, there's probably too many podcasts I've done, but I have published these two books, The Death of the Millennial Left and Marxism and Politics, that really are one book in two volumes,
Right.
where, I elaborate, at least laying out some fundamentals about my approach to Marxism, if people want more detailed treatment of it.
Yeah, actually, in preparation for this, I was reading Marxism and Politics, so I would recommend that. Yeah,
Cool.
and okay,
Thank
well,
you.
thank you. Hey guys, this is me again after the show. I just want to give a little bit more detail about what I'm wanting to do here, just in case you watched and you're curious about the direction that I'm going in. I'll give a little bit more detail here. I didn't want to go too much into it at the intro because I hate watching a video that has a subject and then it takes forever to get started. Okay, so I don't want to give you guys a 5 minute intro, but maybe I'll give you a slightly longer outro. So really, like I said, I really want to, and you heard a note of this at the end with Chris too. I really want to get to more fundamental questions that are taken for granted, that are not necessarily complex, but are just taken for granted, and also more obscure, very specific issues when necessary, because I value really deeply engaging with subjects and reading and understanding these more the specifics that we might take for granted. I want to do both here, and I want to do both in a podcast format. I want to be able to talk to academics and maybe political personalities. I can't make any promises of where that's going to go from here. I really appreciate that Chris came on here and I could just messaged him and I could just talk to him. Um, and so we'll see where it goes from here. I really appreciate as part of this format. I'm really interested in debate and discussion. So any thoughts you have, if you're a Marxist and you have any thoughts, I mean, we can hear the same, more thoughts about Chris, about how he's betraying the tradition and how annoying he is. Perhaps you're that kind of Marxist. Or perhaps you're a big fan of Chris and you're watching and perhaps you appreciate hearing from him more, and I would appreciate hearing that too. If you have any disagreements with me, I didn't get to talk much, and I mean, how much I talk, I think, will vary. I don't want to be like a silent host, but I also want to give my guests a lot of time to speak. So if you have any objections to me or you're curious about what I think about things, you can also throw that in the comment section. And lastly, if there's anyone who you want to have on here, if you can ask, you could reach out to them yourself if you're fans of them and ask them if they want to come on and they can talk to me. Or you can let me know people you think who would be able to come on here. Obviously, my reach is not very big at the moment. It's about non existent, but it's something now that I've had Chris on. So, yeah, I mean, if you can find people who you think are um, that you really like to hear me speak to, yeah, let me know. I'd really like to hear that. Genuinely, whatever you think, I'd love to hear it. And once again, I really appreciate you watching, and I really appreciate that I could have Chris on. I've been watching him for a few months now, learning a lot from him about Marxism, and just kind of broadening my understanding of the world. Obviously, I have a lot of disagreements with him, plenty, but I still really appreciate that I got to learn so much from him and then actually get to talk to him. It's really cool. And yeah, so once again, I appreciate it. And I hope you have a great day or evening or morning or whatever it is for you.